Sometimes you do a video and when going through the comments, you discover that there are themes that pop up and they actually inspire yet another video. And this is one of those cases. So yesterday we did the one on our 65 Barracuda. We gave the car a tune-up and then we were having issues with the choke and low-speed drivability. And we determined that the intake manifold crossover, the heat crossover, the exhaust crossover at the bottom of the intake manifold was blocked. Very common problem. Now, in that video we said, yes, it's a throwaway intake manifold, it's not worth getting involved in trying to clean it. Yes, I know it can be cleaned. I've cleaned dozens and dozens of them, but that's a throwaway intake manifold. It's a later EGR manifold, it's a dual plane, it's not the one I want for that car. So I've got the correct single plane 9 EGR valve intake coming now, right? So I'll have that within a day or two. But the overriding comment, like the one I kept seeing over and over and over and over again, is, can't you just fix this with a manual choke? Haven't you ever heard of a manual choke? I actually had people scolding me. You know, you could start it without a choke. Well, duh, I know that. It has nothing to do with the choke or the actual starting of the car. It has to do with its low-speed drivability and that lack of heat onto the intake manifold with a stock production line type of carburetor, not an aftermarket carburetor like a Holly or an Edelbrock, something that's tuned or calibrated for performance, but one that's calibrated for economy and drivability, like the stock BBD carburetor on that car is. Well, you need that heat under the intake manifold for that carburetor to work correctly. So just putting a choke on it, yes, that would make it easier to start in cold weather for the first second or two. And then you can feather the throttle and keep it alive until everything gets warm enough to start vaporizing fuel. That's not the issue. The issue is drivability. So there was another thing too. People kept bringing up the exhaust flapper in the exhaust manifold. There's a flapper valve that helps to force hot air, helps to force exhaust under the intake manifold to rapidly heat it. All right, so let's look at that part and explain how it works and explain how it really has nothing to do with the situation that we've got. So this is the stock exhaust manifold, passenger side exhaust manifold from a big block Chrysler. And here is that flapper valve assembly that is mentioned. Now, inside the casting here is an actual flapper valve, just like this. And it's controlled by this thermostatic spring. So for the first, I don't know, 30 seconds, minute that the engine is running when you first start it, this flapper is closed. And because it's closed, the exhaust can't flow through its normal path. It gets backed up over here and it's forced through that dual port in the cylinder head. And I'll get to that in a second. Once this manifold reaches basically operating temperature, this spring relaxes and that flapper is open. So this only applies when the engine is first started. And that's why you can put a set of headers on a car and you don't really find a detrimental effect to the way it runs overall. It may take a little bit longer for it to run smoothly when you first start it because it doesn't have that flapper. But once the engine is warmed up, or at least once the exhaust manifold is warmed up, it does nothing. So that's the situation with that. Now, in this situation here, we have a deliberately blocked off exhaust crossover. Now, and a lot of people who use gaskets, they make solid gaskets to block off this heat crossover, the heat stove. I prefer to just weld them closed because I have found that those gaskets will burn through over time. So when I'm going to block the manifold, or if I'm going to block the heat crossover, I just weld the passages closed. And that's what I've done here with this intake manifold. So the reason that was done here is for overall performance improvement. But there's a catch. There's a catch. A stock carburetor, a regular production line carburetor, like the BBD on our Barracuda, is calibrated to be run with the exhaust manifold heat, lightening up the mixture. They're calibrated lean. So the goal with that carburetor is drivability. Obviously, you want smooth transition to the throttle, and you want maximum economy. And so it's calibrated that way. Now you can crack that carburetor open and you can start playing with drop rods and jets and so on and so forth. But it's not a practical solution. That's not the purpose of it. Now, an aftermarket carburetor, especially when it's intended for performance use, is calibrated richer for that idle and low speed situation without exhaust heat underneath the carburetor. So they're assuming, when they put out a Holley or an Edelbrock, whatever, they're assuming you're using a high performance intake manifold, possibly an air gap type of intake manifold where there's no heat underneath it at all. And so those carburetors are calibrated slightly fatter at idle and off idle to compensate for that. At wide open throttle, it's a whole different situation. We're talking about low speed drivability. So in this case here, we've blocked off the exhaust crossover, and we're using an Edelbrock, which is automatically, it's an aftermarket carburetor, but we've also tuned this thing with the drop rods. See, underneath these two covers are a pair of drop rods, and those drop rods partially block the primary jets. When you put a thinner drop rod in here, you're actually increasing the size of the primary jet. You're allowing a little more fuel to flow through at small throttle openings. And so that extra fuel compensates for the lack of heat underneath it. The sacrifice is, I don't know, probably a mile per gallon or thereabouts, but an overall improvement of about 25 horsepower. So it's absolutely worth doing. But again, see, there's that trade-off. And when you're talking about, I always got to, anytime I do a video at the house, I've always got to compete with neighbors and delivery trucks and stuff like that. I don't know how Scotty Kilmer does it, but that's what I've got going on there right now. So in this situation, this car is set up with a manual choke, and it's also set up with that heat crossover and a fatter jetted carburetor. It all works together. It's all a system. So for the situation with the Barracuda, no, a manual choke would not make any difference at all in the drivability. There's one other factor to this too, and this is something that you really got to understand. As the fuel is drawn through the carburetor, it's atomized. And as it's atomized, the temperature drops. So it actually has a cooling effect on this part of the intake manifold. So let's just say this engine's completely warmed up and all of its surfaces are at 200 degrees, right? So the cylinder head, the intake manifold, the runners, the area under the carburetor, you're idling along or driving along very slow speeds, and everything's at approximately 200 degrees. And at that temperature, some of the atomized gasoline that comes through gets vaporized on its way into the cylinder. Let's just say you run this thing hard now, okay, wide open throttle, or you make, let's say, a quarter-mile pass with it, or you run it hard for an exit or two on the highway. If you were to stop immediately and check the temperatures, you would find that this is 200 degrees, this is 200 degrees, and then this is going to be like 150 degrees, because the big volume of fuel that's passing through the carburetor and getting atomized has a drastic effect on the temperature there. So you will find that if you go to drive away easily after a hard extended run, it'll want to stumble. It won't want to take the throttle smoothly. It takes a little bit of time for that heat to build back up again. If the heat crossover is intact underneath it, you don't get that temperature drop. The heat from the stove under the carburetor keeps that vaporization process going. You don't want to vaporize all of the fuel. See, think of it this way, right? Fuel comes through the carburetor and it gets atomized. When you first start an engine, that's why they don't run so hot when you first start them, because the engine isn't lighting any type of vapor, it's lighting the mist that's in there. Now, as the intake valve starts to heat up and the atomized fuel comes through and hits the back face of that intake valve, the first part of the engine warming up, some of that gets vaporized, and then the spark plug grabs onto those vapors and lights those. So basically those vapors are the fuse that lights the firecracker that are the droplets. Does that make any sense? So where was I even going with this? I don't remember. I lost my way. So without the addition of that under carburetor heat, you end up having to jet the thing richer to make up for the lack of vaporization. The trade-off is horsepower. And you go back to our Barracuda, we can add a choke. It does not make any difference. We could put a flapper on the exhaust. It does not make any difference. The big problem here now is, as you're driving the car, the temperature underneath the carburetor drops, and now there's no vaporization. It makes it harder to light, and you end up with a slight drivability issue. In some cases, yeah, and see, it all depends now too, because different engines operating in the different circumstances will react differently. So we're talking about broad averages here, but if you take a stock carburetor, it's calibrated to be run with intake manifold heat. In other words, it's calibrated lean. And you take that heat away, you have intermittent drivability issues. It will make you absolutely insane. So I hope that answered some of the comments in there. Yes, I know what a manual choke is. Look, I have one right there. There's a manual choke. I put it on there myself. I accomplished that. So yeah, I know how all of that stuff works. The problem is not the choke and starting the engine. The problem is maintaining the choke in an open position once the engine is warmed up, which it can't do unless it has heat underneath the carburetor. And also, but most importantly, that low speed drivability with a stock carburetor. All right? Okay, I hope that cleared stuff up. I'll see you tomorrow.